A Werewolf Shifter Romance, written by Amelia Hart. Chapter 1. The Proclamation. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Nordvale Castle, casting golden patterns across the stone floors that Rose Fletcher had scrubbed countless times before. Her hands moved methodically over the polished wood of the Alpha King's desk, the familiar routine bringing her a measure of peace that had become increasingly rare in recent days. At 22, she had spent more years within these walls than she cared to count, each day blending into the next in a comfortable rhythm of service. The scent of beeswax and lavender oil clung to her simple brown dress as she worked, her long chestnut hair pulled back in a practical braid that reached nearly to her waist. Rose had always been grateful for the anonymity her position provided, invisible among the castle staff, free to observe the grand machinations of court life without being observed in return. That peace shattered the moment the herald's horn echoed through the corridors. Rose straightened, her cloth falling forgotten to the desk, as the sound reverberated through the stone walls. 3 long blasts meant a royal proclamation, something that happened perhaps once or twice a year. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs for reasons she couldn't quite name, an instinctual dread creeping up her spine as footsteps thundered past the chamber doors. By royal decree, the herald's voice boomed from the courtyard below, carrying clearly through the open windows. His Majesty, Alpha King Alaric Northwood, calls forth all daughters of Alpha blood from across the realm. The ancient laws demand that no Alpha King shall rule without a Luna Queen at his side. Rose's hands clenched at her sides. She had known this day would come eventually. Everyone in the kingdom had whispered about it since the old king's sudden death 6 months prior. Alaric had assumed the throne at 26, unmarked and unmated, a situation that grew more precarious with each passing week. 3 days hence, the herald continued, his words striking Rose's chest with the force of physical blows. The competition shall begin. Tests of strength, wisdom, and grace shall determine which among the noble daughters proves most worthy. On the 3rd evening, a grand ball shall seal the fate of our kingdom, where His Majesty shall choose his bride. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Rose found herself frozen in place, staring blindly at the papers scattered across Alaric's desk. Documents she had organized just that morning, back when the world still made sense. Treaties and trade agreements seemed laughably insignificant now, mere ink on parchment compared to the upheaval about to descend upon the castle. A knock at the chamber door made her jump, and she quickly snatched up her cleaning supplies as one of the senior housekeepers bustled in. "Rose, girl, what are you still doing here?" Martha's weathered face was flushed with excitement and anxiety in equal measure. "Haven't you heard? We've got preparation enough for 3 lifetimes ahead of us. 100 princesses, they're saying. 100! The castle will be bursting at the seams." 100, Rose echoed faintly, the number sitting heavy on her tongue. The idea of so many noble daughters flooding the halls she called home felt overwhelming in a way she couldn't articulate. Aye, and every one of them thinking she'll be the next Luna Queen. Martha shook her head, already moving toward the windows to check that they sparkled appropriately for royal inspection. "Mark my words, there'll be more drama in these walls than we've seen since the War of the Western Territories." Rose nodded mutely, gathering her things with hands that trembled slightly. As she moved toward the door, a flash of memory struck her with unexpected violence. Herself at 8 years old, small and terrified, being led through these same corridors by gentle hands. Alaric's hands, though he had been only 12 then, still more boy than the imposing king he had become. The memory brought with it the familiar ache in her chest, the hollow sensation that had plagued her for as long as she could remember. She pressed her fingers briefly to her sternum, trying to ease the phantom pain, then hurried from the chamber before Martha could notice her distress. The corridors buzzed with activity as news of the proclamation spread. Servants rushed past carrying linens and flowers, their chatter a constant stream of speculation and gossip. Rose kept her head down and moved through the chaos, seeking the relative quiet of the lower levels where the kitchens and servant quarters lay. But even there, she couldn't escape the weight of what was coming. 100 princesses, each one capable of the very thing Rose had never managed to achieve, each one able to shift into their wolf form, to embrace the supernatural heritage that seemed to have passed her by entirely. At 22, Rose had long since accepted the bitter truth. She was wolfless. The transformation that should have come naturally in her teens had never manifested, leaving her stranded in human form while others around her embraced their dual nature. It was a source of shame so profound she rarely allowed herself to dwell on it. Yet the approaching competition made it impossible to ignore. She found herself in the castle gardens as the sun reached its peak, seeking solace among the roses that had given her her name. The irony wasn't lost on her. Flowers were beautiful, but they were also fragile, unable to defend themselves when winter came. Sometimes I think these gardens are the only honest thing about court life. The voice made her spin around, heart leaping into her throat. Alaric stood at the garden's entrance, no longer the boy who had saved her all those years ago, but a man grown, powerful, and commanding in ways that made her chest tighten. His dark hair caught the sunlight, revealing the silver threads that had appeared since he'd taken the crown, premature markers of the burdens he carried. But it was his eyes that held her captive, the same warm brown that had haunted her dreams since childhood. They were studying her with an intensity that made her want to flee and stay in equal measure. "Your Majesty," she managed, dropping into a curtsy that felt clumsy and inadequate. "I didn't realize you were... I should go. You must have preparations." Rose. Her name on his lips stopped her mid-sentence. "You don't need to run from me." The gentleness in his voice was almost her undoing. This was the boy who had found her broken and bleeding, who had whispered reassurances while she recovered from horrors too great for a child to bear. But he was also the king, and she was nothing more than a servant. The distance between them had grown with each passing year, each new responsibility that pulled him further from the simple friendship they had once shared. "The proclamation," she said quietly, unable to meet his gaze. "It must be difficult, having your choice made for you." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of the vulnerability she remembered from their shared childhood. For just a moment, the king's mask slipped, revealing the man beneath. "Choice," he repeated with a bitter laugh. "Yes, I suppose that's what they're calling it." Before she could respond, voices drifted toward them from the castle. Finn's voice, she realized, calling for the king. Alaric's jaw tightened, and when he looked at her again, the vulnerability was gone, replaced by the careful composure of a ruler. "I should go," he said, though he made no move to leave. "There will be much to arrange." Rose nodded, stepping back to give him space to pass. But as he drew level with her, he paused, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical touch. "Rose," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note she couldn't interpret. "Whatever happens in the coming days, remember that you belong here. This is your home." Then he was gone, leaving her alone among the roses with her heart racing and her mind spinning with questions she dared not voice. The afternoon sun seemed suddenly too bright, the garden walls too confining. She pressed her palms to her cheeks, feeling the heat that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the way her king had looked at her. In the distance, she could hear the first carriages arriving, the sound of horses and voices that meant her quiet world was about to be shattered forever. 100 princesses, each one everything she was not, each one a potential future she could never claim. The ache in her chest deepened, and for the first time in years, Rose found herself wondering what it would feel like to transform, to embrace a heritage that seemed forever beyond her reach. The longing was so sharp it left her breathless, a reminder of all the ways she would never be enough. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the garden, Rose Fletcher stood among her namesake flowers and tried to prepare herself for the competition that would change everything, even if she would only be watching from the sidelines. Chapter 2. First Blood. The first day of competition dawned with a crispness that seemed to mirror the tension crackling through Nordvale Castle. Rose Fletcher moved through the servant corridors like a ghost, her arms laden with fresh linens for the guest chambers that now housed the realm's most eligible daughters. Each footstep echoed her growing sense of displacement in what had once been her sanctuary. The great hall had been transformed overnight into an arena of sorts, with raised platforms and viewing galleries that allowed the court to observe the trials. Rose found herself assigned to serve refreshments to the noble observers, a task that placed her directly in the path of events she would have preferred to avoid entirely. Princess Evangeline de Ravenmore commanded attention the moment she entered the hall, her platinum hair gleaming like spun silver in the morning light. At 24, she possessed the kind of calculated beauty that spoke of careful breeding and ruthless ambition. Rose noticed how the other princesses seemed to orbit around her, drawn by some invisible magnetism that had little to do with friendship and everything to do with power. "The strength trials will test your ability to maintain control under pressure," Master Harold announced from his position beside the throne, where King Alaric sat in silent observation. "Combat, archery, and mounted warfare, each discipline essential for a Luna Queen who may one day need to defend her realm." Rose positioned herself near the refreshment table, her brown eyes fixed on the unfolding spectacle with a mixture of fascination and growing unease. The first princess to take the combat ring was a fierce warrior from the Eastern Territories, her movements fluid and deadly as she faced off against a seasoned guard. The clash of steel on steel rang through the hall, punctuated by the appreciative murmurs of the watching nobility. But it was the scent that hit Rose first, the sharp, metallic tang of barely controlled aggression mixed with something wilder, something that made her stomach clench with inexplicable dread. The princess's eyes had begun to glow with an inner fire, her canine teeth extending as her wolf rose closer to the surface. "Yield!" the guard called out, recognizing the signs of an impending shift. The princess snarled, beyond hearing now, lost in the red haze of battle fury. Her opponent stumbled backward, his training warring with his instinct for self-preservation as claws began to sprout from her fingertips. Rose watched in horror as the scene spiraled toward disaster. The other servants had frozen in place, their faces pale with fear, while the nobility leaned forward with the ghoulish fascination of spectators at a blood sport. Without conscious thought, Rose stepped forward. The movement drew the princess's attention like a magnet, those glowing eyes locking onto her with predatory intensity. Every instinct Rose possessed screamed at her to run, to hide, to make herself small and invisible as she had learned to do so many years ago. But between her and the enraged shifter stood two young serving girls, barely 14 years old, their faces white with terror. Something deep in Rose's chest stirred, a warmth that spread outward from her core, like liquid sunlight. Her vision sharpened with startling clarity. Every detail of the hall suddenly crystal clear. The grain of the wooden floors, the individual threads in the tapestries, the rapid heartbeats of everyone around her. Time seemed to slow as she grabbed both girls and hauled them behind the relative safety of a support pillar, her body moving with a speed and strength that should have been impossible. The princess slammed into the stone where they had been standing, her claws leaving deep gouges in the ancient masonry. "Enough!" King Alaric's voice cut through the chaos with the authority of absolute command. The princess froze mid-swipe, her wolf retreating so rapidly that she collapsed to her knees, gasping and disoriented. Rose found herself trembling against the pillar, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might burst from her chest. The strange warmth that had filled her was already fading, leaving behind a hollow ache and the terrible certainty that something fundamental had just shifted in her carefully ordered world. From across the hall, she felt the weight of Alaric's gaze like a physical touch. His brown eyes, so like her own, held a mixture of concern and something else, something that made her breath catch in her throat. Recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. "Lady Miriam will be escorted to her chambers to recover," Harold announced smoothly, his diplomatic training allowing him to gloss over the incident with practiced ease. "Perhaps we might adjourn for refreshments before continuing with the archery trials." The hall erupted into nervous chatter as nobles processed what they had witnessed. Rose used the distraction to slip away, her legs unsteady as she made her way toward the servants' quarters. But she hadn't gone far when a hand touched her shoulder, gentle but insistent. "Rose." Finn Ashcroft's weathered face was creased with concern, his brown eyes kind but worried. "His Majesty would like a word." Her stomach dropped. "I didn't mean to interfere. The girls were in danger and I couldn't—" "Peace," Finn said quietly, guiding her toward a small antechamber off the main hall. "You're not in trouble." But what happened back there? That wasn't normal human reflexes. Rose's mouth went dry. She had feared this moment for so long. The possibility that someone might notice the strange incidents that had been increasing in frequency over the past months. Moments when her senses seemed sharper. When her body moved faster than it should. When something wild and foreign stirred in the depths of her chest. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered, but the lie felt heavy on her tongue. Finn studied her with the shrewd gaze of a man who had served as beta to 2 kings. "Have you spoken to Master Harold about your condition?" The word hung between them like an accusation. Rose had always assumed her inability to shift was simply a cruel twist of fate, a punishment for some unknown transgression. But Finn's tone suggested something different, something that made hope flutter dangerously in her chest. "My condition? Severe trauma can sometimes lock away a shifter's abilities," Finn said carefully. "Create barriers that prevent transformation. It's rare, but not unheard of. Harold mentioned that he's seen it before, in survivors of particularly brutal attacks." Rose's knees nearly buckled. The possibility that she wasn't truly wolfless, that there might be a reason for her failures, was almost too overwhelming to process. "But I've tried so many times. Every full moon, every moment of stress or anger. Nothing ever happens, because your wolf is protecting you," a new voice said from the doorway. Master Harold entered the chamber, his weathered face grave with understanding. "She's been shielding you from memories too painful to bear, keeping herself locked away until you're strong enough to handle the truth of what you are." The old counselor's words hit Rose like physical blows, each one reshaping her understanding of herself in ways that left her reeling. What truth? But before Harold could answer, commotion erupted from the main hall. Shouts of alarm and the unmistakable sound of weapons being drawn. Through the stone walls came a howl that raised every hair on Rose's body, wild and savage, and entirely too close. "Rogues!" Finn snarled, his hand flying to the sword at his hip. Inside the castle walls, the attack came with brutal efficiency. Dark shapes poured through the main doors of the hall, their eyes glowing with predatory hunger as they fell upon the assembled nobility. Rose found herself pressed against the wall of the antechamber, watching through the doorway as chaos consumed the space that had been so orderly moments before. Princess Evangeline stood at the center of the maelstrom, her beautiful face transformed by fury as she shifted with liquid grace. Her wolf was magnificent. Silver-white fur and ice-blue eyes that promised death to any who threatened her. But even her formidable skills were being overwhelmed by the sheer number of attackers. Rose saw one of the serving girls, the same child she had saved earlier, trapped beneath an overturned table as a massive rogue stalked toward her, saliva dripping from its jaws. The sight triggered something primal in Rose's chest, a rage so pure and consuming that it burned away every barrier she had ever built. The warmth exploded through her body like lightning, racing along her nerves and setting every cell ablaze. Her vision went white-hot for a moment, then snapped back into focus with startling intensity. She could smell fear and blood and something else, the acrid scent of the rogue's madness. Without conscious decision, Rose launched herself from the antechamber. She moved with inhuman speed, her body flowing around obstacles as if she weighed nothing at all. Her hand closed around a fallen sword, the weapon feeling perfectly balanced in her grip despite her complete lack of training. The rogue spun toward her with a snarl, but Rose was already moving. The blade caught it across the throat in a strike that should have been impossible for someone of her size and training to execute. Dark blood sprayed across the floor as the creature collapsed, its eyes going glassy with death. The serving girl scrambled free, tears streaming down her face as she ran toward the safety of the outer corridors. Rose stood over the rogue's body, her chest heaving with exertion and something else, a wild exhilaration that felt both foreign and utterly natural. When she looked up, she found King Alaric watching her from across the hall, his sword dripping with the blood of his own kills. For a moment that stretched like eternity, their eyes met across the carnage. His brown gaze held wonder and something deeper, a recognition that made her heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with the battle. Then, the moment shattered as more rogues poured through the shattered doors, and the fight resumed with renewed fury. But Rose Fletcher knew that something irreversible had happened in that brief exchange of glances. The careful walls she had built around her true nature were beginning to crack, and what lay beneath might be more dangerous than she had ever dared to imagine. As the last of the rogues fell and silence settled over the blood-stained hall, Rose realized that the competition had taken on an entirely different dimension. This was no longer about choosing a Luna Queen from among the noble daughters of the realm. This was about discovering what she truly was, and whether that truth would save them all or destroy everything she had ever held dear. Chapter 3. Shadows and Revelations. The dawn of the second day brought with it an oppressive weight that seemed to settle over Nordvale Castle like a shroud. Rose Fletcher moved through her morning duties with mechanical precision, her mind still reeling from the events of the previous day. The bloodstains had been scrubbed from the great hall's floors, but the memory of violence lingered in every shadow, every whispered conversation among the staff. She was arranging fresh linens in one of the guest chambers when a familiar voice made her freeze. "Rose." King Alaric stood in the doorway, his imposing frame filling the space completely. Gone was the formal regalia of yesterday's trials. Instead, he wore simple, dark clothing that somehow made him appear more dangerous, not less. His brown eyes, so eerily similar to her own, held an intensity that made her pulse quicken with something that had nothing to do with fear. "Your Majesty," she managed, dropping into a curtsy that felt inadequate under his penetrating gaze. "I was just finishing what you did yesterday," he interrupted, stepping into the chamber and closing the door behind him. That wasn't the action of someone without abilities. Rose's hands trembled as she clutched the linens to her chest. She had dreaded this conversation, knowing it was inevitable after her display in the Great Hall. "I don't know what you mean, Your Majesty." "I simply moved quickly. You moved faster than any human could." His voice was quiet, but implacable. "You lifted a grown man's sword as if it weighed nothing. Your reflexes were—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Supernatural." The word hung between them like an accusation. Rose felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble under the weight of his certainty. For years she had told herself that the strange moments, the enhanced senses, the bursts of impossible strength, were simply her imagination, desperate fantasies of a wolfless girl who longed to belong. "I've tried," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Every full moon, every moment of anger or fear. I've tried to shift until I thought my bones would break from the effort. Nothing ever happens. I'm wolfless, Your Majesty. I've accepted that." Something shifted in Alaric's expression, a softening that transformed his harsh features into something almost tender. "Rose, look at me." Reluctantly, she raised her eyes to meet his. The impact was immediate and overwhelming. Those familiar brown depths seemed to see straight through to her soul, stripping away every pretense and defense she had ever constructed. "Tell me about the night your village was destroyed," he said gently. "All of it. Not the version you've told others, but the truth." The request hit her like a physical blow. Rose had spent 14 years trying to forget that night, burying the memories so deep she sometimes wondered if they had been nothing more than terrible nightmares. But Alaric's presence seemed to create a space where truth was not only possible, but necessary. "I was 8, she began, her voice cracking. "My parents had put me to bed early because there had been strange scents around the village borders. Father said it was probably just passing rogues, but they were being cautious." The memory unfolded with brutal clarity. She could still smell the smoke that had woken her, still hear the screams that had echoed through the night air. I climbed out of bed and looked out the window. There were shapes moving in the darkness. Wolves, but wrong somehow. Their eyes glowed with madness. Alaric moved closer, his presence steadying her even as the memories threatened to overwhelm her completely. "What did you do?" "I ran to my parents' room, but they were already awake. Father was armed and Mother was gathering supplies. They told me to hide, to find the secret space beneath the floorboards that Father had shown me once during a game." Rose's breathing grew shallow as she continued. "But I could hear everything. The rogues breaking down doors, the fighting, the screaming, and then silence. For hours, there was nothing but silence. I stayed hidden, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. But when morning came, Rose's voice broke entirely. I looked through the gap in the floorboards. My parents were there just a few feet away. Their eyes were still open, staring at nothing. Alaric's hand found hers, his warm fingers intertwining with her cold ones. The simple contact was like an anchor in the storm of memory. You were there for 3 days. 3 days, she confirmed. Listening for sounds of other survivors, waiting for the rogues to return. Something inside me died during those 3 days, Your Majesty. Whatever spark makes a shifter able to transform, it was extinguished by fear. No, Alaric said firmly. It wasn't extinguished. It was protected. Before Rose could ask what he meant, a sharp knock interrupted them. Finn Ashcroft entered without waiting for permission, his weathered face grim with purpose. "We have a problem," the beta announced. "Princess Evangeline has been making unauthorized visits to the royal archives. My contacts report she's been asking questions about bloodlines and succession laws, ancient ones." Alaric released Rose's hand, his expression hardening into the mask of kingship once more. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest she knows more about certain lineages than she should. Finn's gaze flicked to Rose meaningfully. She's also been seen in conversation with individuals who don't appear on any official guest lists. Mercenaries by the look of them. A chill ran down Rose's spine. The idea that one of the princesses was actively plotting felt surreal, like something from a dark fairy tale rather than reality. "Double the guard rotations," Alaric commanded, "and have Master Harold meet me in my study within the hour. We need to understand what she's searching for." Finn nodded and departed, leaving Rose alone with her king once more. But the intimate atmosphere had been shattered by the intrusion of politics and danger. "Your Majesty," Rose began, but Alaric shook his head. "Go about your duties for now," he said. "But Rose, be careful. Stay close to the other servants, and don't go anywhere alone." The warning proved prophetic. That evening, as Rose sat down to her simple meal in the servants' hall, she noticed an unusual bitterness to the stew. The taste was subtle, almost masked by the hearty herbs and vegetables, but it set off alarms in her enhanced senses. Wolfsbane. She recognized it from Master Harold's lessons about dangerous plants, administered to all castle staff as a safety precaution. She recognized the faint bitterness instantly, but by then it was too late. Even a single mouthful, once swallowed, was enough to send the poison racing through her veins. The herb was toxic to shifters in large doses, capable of suppressing their abilities or worse. Before she could push the bowl away, dizziness swept over her. The world tilted sideways, and she felt herself sliding from the bench as darkness crept in around the edges of her vision. Strong arms caught her before she hit the stone floor. Through her blurred sight, she saw Alaric's face above her, his features twisted with fury and concern. "Get Harold!" he barked to someone beyond her line of sight. "Now!" Rose tried to speak, to explain what she had tasted, but her tongue felt thick and useless. The wolfsbane was working through her system with alarming speed, confirming what she had begun to suspect about her own nature. "I know what this is," Alaric said grimly, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. "Someone wants to make sure your abilities stay buried." The journey to the royal chambers passed in a haze of semi-consciousness. Rose was dimly aware of being carried through corridors she had never seen, past tapestries and furnishings that spoke of wealth beyond her comprehension. When Alaric finally laid her on what felt like the softest bed in existence, she struggled to focus on his face. "The security measures I put in place after yesterday's attack caught something interesting," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Princess Evangeline was seen near the kitchens earlier this evening. She won't be able to deny her involvement." Master Harold appeared at the bedside, his weathered hands gentle as he examined Rose's dilated pupils and rapid pulse. "Wolfsbane poisoning," he confirmed, "but the fact that it's affecting her so strongly suggests what we suspected is true." "What?" Rose managed to whisper. Harold's ancient eyes were kind but serious as he met her gaze. Signs of the Luna bloodline should have been clear: heightened senses, unnatural resilience. But your childhood trauma buried them so deeply that even the elders could not see. What we mistook for weakness was, in truth, your wolf's desperate attempt to shield you. My dear child, you are not wolfless. You never were. Your wolf has been protecting you. keeping herself locked away until you were strong enough to handle the truth of your heritage. What truth? You carry the bloodline of the Luna ancestors, Alaric said quietly. The original wolves blessed by the moon goddess herself. Your abilities won't just include transformation. They'll encompass healing, enhanced empathy, and the power to strengthen other shifters through your bond. Rose felt tears sliding down her cheeks. Though whether from relief or overwhelm, she couldn't say. Everything she had believed about herself was crumbling, replaced by possibilities she had never dared to imagine. The awakening must be gradual, Harold continued, preparing what looked like an herbal remedy. Too much too fast could shatter your mind. Your wolf has been waiting 14 years for you to be ready. We won't rush her now. As the antidote began to work its way through her system, Rose became aware of something else. A warmth that had nothing to do with the medicine. Alaric had taken her hand again, and through that simple contact, she could feel his emotions as clearly as her own. Concern, protectiveness, and underneath it all, something deeper and more complex that made her breath catch. "Rest now," he murmured, his thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. "Tomorrow, we'll begin to unlock what you truly are." As Rose drifted toward healing sleep, she realized that her world had shifted irrevocably. The frightened, wolfless girl who had scrubbed floors and remained invisible was gone forever, replaced by someone whose very existence might change the fate of the kingdom. The competition for the Alpha King's hand had become something far more dangerous and complex than anyone had anticipated. And at its center stood Rose Fletcher, no longer a servant, but a woman on the verge of discovering powers that could reshape everything she had ever known about herself and her place in the world. Chapter 4. The Royal Ball. The third day of competition arrived draped in an atmosphere of barely contained anticipation. Rose Fletcher moved through the castle corridors with movements that felt different, more fluid, more aware, as if something fundamental in her body was awakening from a long slumber. The wolfsbane poisoning had left her system, but its effects lingered in unexpected ways, having somehow loosened the barriers that had held her true nature captive for so long. She paused in the doorway of the great hall, watching as the final trials of the day unfolded. These were tests of grace and social acumen, the subtle arts that would be required of a Luna Queen in court settings. Princesses demonstrated their mastery of etiquette, their ability to navigate complex political conversations, and their skill at the intricate dances that marked formal occasions. Princess Evangeline commanded the center of attention as always, her platinum hair arranged in elaborate braids that caught the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. But there was something different about her today. A tension in her posture that spoke of desperation barely held in check. Rose noticed how Evangeline's pale blue eyes kept darting toward the shadows, as if she were seeing things that others could not. "The evening's festivities will conclude with the royal ball," Master Harold announced to the assembled court. "His Majesty will dance with each worthy candidate before making his decision known to the realm." Rose felt her stomach clench at the words. Tonight, King Alaric would choose his Luna Queen from among the gathered princesses. The competition that had turned her world upside down would finally reach its conclusion, and she would return to her quiet life as a servant, carrying with her the newfound knowledge of what she might have been. As the afternoon trials concluded, and the great hall was transformed for the evening's celebration, Rose found herself assigned to serve among the musicians' gallery. It was a position that afforded her an excellent view of the proceedings, while keeping her safely removed from the noble guests below. The ball began as the sun touched the horizon, bathing the hall in golden light that reflected off the polished marble floors. Rose had never seen anything so magnificent. Hundreds of candles flickered in massive chandeliers, their warm glow making the assembled nobles appear almost ethereal in their finest attire. King Alaric entered last, resplendent in midnight blue velvet that complemented his dark hair and brought out the warm brown of his eyes. Those eyes, so like her own, swept the room with practiced assessment before settling briefly on the musicians' gallery. For one heart-stopping moment, Rose felt the weight of his gaze, felt that strange connection that had been growing between them pulse with sudden intensity. The dancing began with formal ceremony, each princess taking her turn to partner with the king. Rose watched from above, her hands clenched tightly in her lap as she tried to ignore the unfamiliar ache in her chest. Jealousy was a useless emotion for someone in her position, Yet she found herself cataloging every smile Alaric bestowed, every graceful turn across the dance floor. When Princess Evangeline stepped forward to claim her dance, Rose felt the atmosphere in the hall shift dramatically. There was something almost hypnotic about the way the princess moved, her steps perfectly synchronized with the music as if she were part of the melody itself. But Rose's enhanced senses picked up something else. A sweet, cloying scent that didn't belong among the natural perfumes of the assembled nobility. Magic. Dark magic that made Rose's skin crawl with instinctive revulsion. Evangeline was weaving something subtle but powerful around Alaric as they danced, her pale blue eyes fixed on his face with predatory intensity. Rose could see the exact moment when the spell began to take hold. The slight glazing of Alaric's expression, the way his movements became more mechanical, less naturally graceful. Rose gripped the gallery railing so tightly that the wood creaked under the pressure. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to act, to somehow break the insidious enchantment being woven around her king. But what could a servant do against such powerful magic? The answer came from deep within her chest, a warmth that spread outward through her limbs with the force of a wildfire. Rose felt her senses explode into hyper-awareness. She could hear individual heartbeats in the crowd below, could distinguish between dozens of different scents, could see with startling clarity despite the dim lighting of the gallery. Without conscious decision, she stood and moved toward the grand staircase that led to the main floor. Rose, Finn Ashcroft materialized at her elbow, his weathered face creased with concern. "What are you doing?" "She's using magic on him," Rose whispered, her voice tight with barely contained fury. "I can smell it. Dark magic, wrong magic. She's trying to control him." Finn's expression darkened as he followed her gaze to the dancing couple below. "I can sense it too, now that you've pointed it out. But Rose, you can't simply walk onto the ballroom floor. You're not—" "I know what I am," Rose interrupted, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "Or rather, I know what I'm not. I'm not going to stand here and watch while she steals his free will." Before Finn could stop her, Rose was moving down the staircase with fluid grace that would have been impossible just days before. The enhanced awareness flowing through her body made every step perfect, every movement instinctively calculated for maximum effect. The crowd parted before her as if she belonged there, nobles stepping aside with expressions of confusion and growing interest. Rose barely noticed them. Her entire focus was fixed on the dancing couple at the center of the hall and the sickly sweet magic that surrounded them. She reached the edge of the dance floor just as the music reached a crescendo. Evangeline's magic was at its strongest now, weaving visible tendrils of shadow around Alaric's head that made Rose's enhanced vision swim with nausea. "Your Majesty!" Rose called out, her voice carrying clearly across the sudden silence that had fallen over the ballroom. Alaric's head snapped toward her, and Rose saw the exact moment when the sound of her voice shattered Evangeline's carefully constructed spell. His brown eyes cleared, confusion and then recognition flickering across his features as he focused on her face. Rose. Her name on his lips sounded like a prayer, like salvation, like coming home. Evangeline snarled, her beautiful face contorting with rage as her magic dissipated into harmless wisps. "How dare you interrupt?" "I believe," Alaric said quietly, his voice carrying the full weight of royal authority, "that I would like to dance with Rose." The gasps that rippled through the assembled nobility were audible even over the musicians, who had stumbled to a halt in their confusion. Rose felt every eye in the hall fixed upon her, felt the weight of judgment and shock and disbelief pressing down like a physical force. But none of it mattered when Alaric stepped away from Evangeline and extended his hand toward her. Rose took it without hesitation, her fingers sliding against his with a rightness that made her heart race. The moment their skin made contact, she felt something shift inside her chest. A barrier cracking, a door opening, a part of herself awakening that had slept for far too long. The music began again, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as the musicians recognized their king's unspoken command. Alaric led Rose into the center of the ballroom, his hand warm and steady at her waist, his brown eyes never leaving her face. "You saved me," he murmured as they began to move together with natural synchronization. Her magic was strong, but your voice cut through it like a blade. Rose felt herself falling into the rhythm of the dance, her body responding to his lead with an ease that should have been impossible for someone without formal training. I couldn't let her hurt you. I couldn't stand by and watch. Why? The question was barely a whisper, meant only for her ears. Rose looked up into those familiar brown eyes, so like her own, so warm and understanding, and felt the last of her defenses crumble. Because you matter to me, more than my position, more than propriety, more than fear of what others might think. Something blazed in Alaric's expression, an intensity that made Rose's knees weak and her breath catch in her throat. As they turned together across the polished floor, she felt that strange warmth in her chest expand, spreading through her limbs with tingling awareness. Her senses sharpened beyond anything she had experienced before. She could hear the rapid beating of Alaric's heart, could smell the unique scent that was purely him, could see every fleck of gold in his brown eyes. The world around them seemed to slow and crystallize, every detail etched with perfect clarity. And then she felt it. The first stirring of something wild and powerful deep in her chest. Not quite a transformation. Not yet. But the promise of one. The whisper of claws beneath her fingernails. The faint elongation of her canine teeth. The preternatural grace that suddenly informed her every movement. Rose was no longer wolfless. She never had been. The realization hit her with such force that she stumbled, but Alaric's strong arms kept her upright, kept her anchored as her world shifted around them. I can feel her, Rose whispered in wonder. My wolf. She's there. She's been there all along. Alaric's smile was brilliant with pride, and something deeper, something that made her heart stutter in her chest. I know. I can sense her too. But their moment of revelation was shattered by a shriek of pure rage from across the ballroom. Evangeline stood at the edge of the dance floor, her beautiful face transformed by fury, her pale blue eyes blazing with malevolent power. You think you can steal what's mine? She snarled, dark magic beginning to coalesce around her like storm clouds. I won't let some servant girl ruin everything I've worked for. Shadow magic erupted from Evangeline's hands in deadly tendrils that raced across the ballroom floor toward Rose. The assembled nobles screamed and scattered, but there was nowhere to run in the enclosed space. Alaric spun Rose behind him, his own power rising to meet the threat. But Rose knew with sudden certainty that he wouldn't be fast enough. The magic was too strong, too focused, too full of years of accumulated hatred and ambition. Time seemed to slow as the shadowy attack bore down upon them. Rose felt her wolf surge upward in response, felt power she had never imagined flow through her body like molten gold. She stepped around Alaric's protective form and raised her hands, not knowing what she intended to do, but trusting in the instincts that were finally awakening. Light exploded from her palms, pure golden radiance that met Evangeline's shadows head-on and consumed them utterly. The clash of opposing magics sent shockwaves through the hall, shattering windows and extinguishing half the candles in their chandeliers. When the light faded and Rose's vision cleared, she found herself standing in a circle of awed silence, her hands still glowing faintly with residual power. Evangeline lay unconscious on the floor, her magic spent and her beautiful face peaceful for the first time since Rose had known her. "Arrest her," Alaric commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Princess Evangeline de Ravenmore stands accused of using forbidden magic against the crown and attempting to assault a citizen of this realm." As guards moved to secure the unconscious princess, Rose swayed on her feet, the sudden absence of power leaving her drained and disoriented. But once again, Alaric was there to catch her, his arms strong and sure around her trembling form. "It's over," he murmured against her hair. "You're safe. We're both safe." Rose looked up into his beloved face and saw her future written there, not as a servant, but as something she had never dared to dream she could become. The competition for the Alpha King's bride had ended in a way no one could have predicted. And Rose Fletcher, the girl who had thought herself wolfless and worthless, stood at the center of it all with power, singing through her veins and love blooming in her heart. Chapter 5. The Weight of Truth. The aftermath of the royal ball descended upon Nordvale Castle like a suffocating shroud. Rose Fletcher found herself confined to a small chamber in the eastern wing, Not quite a prisoner, but certainly no longer free to move about the castle as she pleased. The events of the previous evening felt surreal in the harsh light of dawn. Had she really stood before the assembled nobility and wielded power beyond her understanding? Had she truly danced in the arms of her king while every eye in the realm watched in stunned disbelief? The answer came with the sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor outside her door, followed by voices raised in heated debate. Through the thick stone walls, Rose could make out fragments of conversation that made her stomach clench with growing dread. "Witchcraft," one voice declared with righteous indignation. What else could explain such a display? A servant girl defeating a princess with forbidden magic? She has no noble blood. Another added. No training in the arts of war or statecraft. Yet she wielded power that made the very stones tremble. It defies all natural law. Rose pressed her back against the cold stone wall, her enhanced hearing picking up every damning word. The fear in their voices was unmistakable, but underneath it lay something far more dangerous, the kind of superstitious hatred that had led to witch burnings in darker times. A sharp knock at her door made her jump, her heart leaping into her throat. But instead of the guards she had been expecting, Master Harold entered the chamber, his weathered face grave with concern. "They're calling for your arrest," he said without preamble, settling his aged frame into the room's single chair. "The royal council convenes within the hour, and there are those who would see you tried for sorcery." Rose felt the blood drain from her face. "But I was protecting the king. Princess Evangeline was using dark magic against him, a claim that stands without proof now that she lies unconscious in the dungeons." Harold interrupted gently. "Her magic dissipated when your power struck her. There are no traces left to examine, no evidence beyond your word." The injustice of it hit Rose like a physical blow. She had risked everything to save Alaric from Evangeline's insidious spell, only to find herself accused of the very crime she had sought to prevent. "What does His Majesty say?" she asked, though part of her feared the answer. Harold's expression softened with something that might have been pity. "He fights for you, child. Even now, he stands before the council demanding your freedom. But there are political considerations, pressures that even a king cannot entirely ignore." Before Rose could ask what he meant, the door burst open to admit a figure she had hoped never to see conscious again. Princess Evangeline de Ravenmore entered the chamber, her platinum hair disheveled, and her pale blue eyes blazing with fanatic intensity. The guards who should have been restraining her were nowhere to be seen. "So here she is," Evangeline snarled, her beautiful face twisted with malice. "The little servant who thinks she can steal a crown through trickery and lies." Harold rose swiftly from his chair, his hand moving to the ceremonial dagger at his belt. "Princess, you should be in custody. How did you escape?" Evangeline laughed, the sound sharp and brittle. "I didn't escape, old man. I was released on the orders of certain council members who understand the truth of what happened last night." Rose felt ice forming in her veins. If Evangeline had allies among the nobility, allies powerful enough to override the king's direct orders, then the situation was far worse than she had imagined. "You have no proof of your accusations," Harold said firmly, though Rose could sense the uncertainty beneath his words. "The king himself witnessed. The king is bewitched." Evangeline cut him off savagely. "Can't you see it? This creature has been working her influence on him for years, slowly corrupting his judgment, making him dependent on her presence. Last night was simply the culmination of her long campaign to steal the throne." The princess stepped closer to Rose, her eyes glowing with an inner fire that spoke of magic barely contained. "But I know what you really are, servant girl. I know about your bloodline, your cursed heritage. The archives hold records of your family, practitioners of the old magic, the forbidden arts that nearly destroyed the realm centuries ago." Rose's breath caught in her throat. The mention of her bloodline sent a chill racing down her spine, awakening memories of conversations with Master Harold about Luna ancestors and ancient powers. "That's impossible," Harold protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "The old bloodlines were thought extinct. Were they?" Evangeline's smile was sharp as a blade. "Or were they simply better at hiding their true nature? Tell me, Rose Fletcher, when did you first feel the stirring of power in your veins? How long have you been practicing the dark arts in secret? Rose opened her mouth to deny the accusations, but found herself unable to speak. Because underneath Evangeline's malicious words lay a grain of terrifying truth. She had been hiding her true nature, even from herself, the strange moments of enhanced strength and speed, the inexplicable awareness of things beyond normal human perception. How could she prove they weren't the result of forbidden magic when she herself didn't understand their source? I can see the truth in your silence, Evangeline continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy. You've been alone for so long, haven't you? Desperate to belong, to be more than just a servant. The dark powers whispered to you in the night, promised you everything you dreamed of having. And slowly, inevitably, you began to listen. As Evangeline spoke, Rose felt a familiar warmth building in her chest, but this time it was tainted with something else. Something that made her skin crawl with revulsion. The princess was weaving magic around her words, subtle but insidious, designed to make her doubt her own memories and motivations. Stop, Rose whispered, pressing her hands to her temples as foreign thoughts began to intrude on her consciousness. You're the one using dark magic. I can feel it. Can you? Evangeline's eyes gleamed with triumph. Or is that simply your own darkness recognizing its kin? The magical assault intensified, sending Rose to her knees as wave after wave of corrupted images flooded her mind. She saw herself as Evangeline wanted others to see her. A scheming sorceress who had spent years infiltrating the castle, slowly corrupting its noble inhabitants with subtle spells and manipulation. But worse than the false visions were the real memories that came with them. Fragments of the night her village was destroyed, viewed now through the lens of Evangeline's poisonous suggestions. Had the rogues really attacked randomly? Or had something about her family, about her bloodline, drawn them like moths to a flame? She's breaking, Evangeline observed with clinical satisfaction. The truth has a way of surfacing, doesn't it? Soon she'll confess everything. Her years of deception, her use of forbidden magic, her plans to corrupt our king and steal our throne. Rose felt herself drowning in the tide of false memories and twisted truths. The distinction between reality and Evangeline's magical lies was becoming harder to maintain with each passing second. Perhaps it would be easier to simply surrender, to accept the guilt and shame being pressed upon her. No. The word burst from her lips with such force that the stone walls trembled. I won't let you rewrite my history. Power exploded from Rose's body, not the controlled golden radiance of the previous night, but something wilder and more primal. The magical assault shattered like glass, leaving Evangeline stumbling backward with shock and pain written across her features. You want to see my true heritage? Rose snarled, rising to her feet with fluid grace. Then witness what the Luna ancestors were truly capable of. Light poured from her skin, but it was no longer purely golden. Threads of silver ran through it, ancient and powerful, carrying with it the scent of moonlight and wildflowers. Rose felt her wolf stirring more strongly than ever before, not with violence but with protective fury that would brook no threat to those she loved. Impossible, Evangeline breathed, her pale blue eyes wide with genuine fear for the first time since Rose had known her. The Luna bloodline was broken centuries ago. The last of them died in the Purge. Clearly not, Master Harold said quietly, his aged voice filled with wonder and dawning understanding. My dear child, you're not just descended from the Luna ancestors. You're their direct heir, the first true Luna born in over 300 years. The revelation hit Rose with stunning force, reshaping her understanding of herself and her place in the world. She wasn't just a servant who had discovered latent shifter abilities. She was the living embodiment of an ancient lineage thought lost forever. This changes everything, Harold continued, his mind clearly racing through the political implications. Under the old laws, the laws that predate even the founding of the kingdom, a true Luna has the right to challenge for the position of Alpha Queen, regardless of birth or station. Evangeline's face contorted with rage. I won't allow it. I've worked too hard, sacrificed too much to see my birthright stolen by some foundling with delusions of grandeur. Shadow magic began to coalesce around the princess once more, but this time Rose was ready for it. Her Luna power rose to meet the threat, and the clash between light and darkness sent shockwaves through the chamber that cracked the stone walls. But even as she fought, Rose felt the weight of responsibility settling upon her shoulders. If she truly was what Harold claimed, then her very existence would reshape the political landscape of the realm. There would be those who would seek to use her, others who would try to destroy her, and still others who would see her as a threat to the established order. The thought of bringing such chaos down upon Alaric and his kingdom filled her with anguish. He had already risked so much by defending her before the council. How could she repay his loyalty by embroiling him in a conflict that might tear his realm apart? As Evangeline's attack faltered, and the princess collapsed once more, drained by the effort of wielding her corrupted magic, Rose came to a painful decision. She couldn't stay at Nordvale Castle. Couldn't remain where her presence would endanger the man she loved, and the home she had known for so long. "I have to leave," she said quietly, the words tearing at her heart even as she spoke them. Master Harold looked stricken. "Child, you can't simply run away from what you are." "I won't bring war to this kingdom," Rose interrupted, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "If staying here means watching Alaric fight battles because of what I am, then I have no choice." She moved toward the chamber's window, her enhanced senses already plotting the safest route down the castle walls. Better to disappear into the night than to watch the realm burn because of her bloodline. But as she reached for the window latch, strong arms encircled her from behind, and she found herself pressed against a familiar chest. "Where exactly do you think you're going?" Alaric's voice was rough with emotion, his breath warm against her ear. Rose closed her eyes, savoring what might be the last moment of peace she would know for a long time. "Somewhere far from here. Somewhere you'll be safe from the consequences of what I am." "And what makes you think," he murmured, turning her gently in his arms, "that I would ever let you face those consequences alone?" When Rose looked up into his beloved brown eyes, she saw not fear or political calculation, but the same unwavering determination that had carried him through his father's death and his own ascension to the throne. "The realm comes first," she whispered. "You taught me that." Alaric's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had finally begun to fall. "You are my realm, Rose Fletcher. Without you, all the rest is just empty stone and meaningless ceremony." The admission broke something loose in Rose's chest, and she found herself rising on her toes to press her lips against his, in a kiss that tasted of desperation and hope in equal measure. For a moment that stretched like eternity, there was nothing but the two of them and the love that had been growing between them for years. When they finally broke apart, Rose could see her future written in Alaric's eyes, not as a fugitive or a political liability, but as something she had never dared dream she could become. "We'll face this together," he said simply. "Whatever comes, we'll meet it as one." Chapter 6. The First Transformation. 2 weeks had passed since the revelations in the castle chamber, and Rose Fletcher found herself in a world transformed beyond recognition. No longer was she confined to servant quarters or relegated to invisible tasks. Instead, she occupied a suite of rooms in the royal wing, with Master Harold as her personal tutor, and King Alaric as her devoted guide through the complexities of her awakening powers. The training sessions took place in a secluded grove beyond the castle walls, where ancient stones formed a natural circle that seemed to hum with residual magic. Each morning, Rose practiced the delicate art of calling forth her wolf, coaxing the wild spirit that had hidden so long in the depths of her soul. "Feel the moonlight in your veins," Alaric instructed, his own wolf form magnificent beside her, a massive creature of midnight fur and golden eyes that radiated alpha authority. "Don't force the change. Invite it." Rose closed her eyes, breathing deeply as she reached inward toward the presence that had grown stronger each day. Her wolf was there, patient and powerful, no longer cowering from memories of blood and death, but stirring with eager anticipation. The familiar warmth spread through her chest. But this time Rose didn't fight it or fear it. She embraced it completely. The transformation began slowly, a tingling in her fingertips that spread up her arms with liquid fire. Her bones stretched and reformed without pain, her muscles flowing like water as they reshaped themselves. When she opened her eyes, the world had exploded into vivid clarity. Every scent distinct, every sound crystal clear. every blade of grass visible in perfect detail. She looked down at her paws. Not the silver she had expected, but pure gold that seemed to capture and reflect the sunlight. Her fur was longer than most wolves, silky and radiant, marking her unmistakably as something beyond ordinary shifter blood. Magnificent, Alaric breathed, shifting back to human form to study her with wonder-filled eyes. You're not just Luna-descended, Rose. You're the first true Luna Queen born in centuries. The title should have overwhelmed her, but instead Rose felt a deep sense of rightness, as if she had finally stepped into a role she was always meant to fill. When she shifted back to human form, the change was seamless, controlled, nothing like the violent struggle she had always imagined. That afternoon, formal documents arrived from the Royal Council. After extensive deliberation and consultation with ancient texts, they had reached their unanimous decision. Rose Fletcher, now acknowledged as Lady Rosalind of the Luna bloodline, was to be recognized as a legitimate candidate for the position of Luna Queen, with all the rights and privileges that status entailed. But their moment of triumph was short-lived. A commotion in the Great Hall drew them from their private celebration, where they found an unexpected visitor waiting with barely contained impatience. Lord Magnus Greywood was a distant relation of the royal line, a man whose political ambitions had long been frustrated by his remote position in the succession. His presence at court was highly unusual, and immediately suspicious. "Your Majesty," he said with a bow that managed to be both respectful and condescending, "I come bearing disturbing news from the Eastern Territories. Word of your unconventional choice for Luna Queen has reached certain ears. There are those who question whether someone so recently emerged from obscurity can truly possess the qualifications necessary for such a vital position." Rose felt Alaric's anger spike, but her own response surprised her with its calm certainty. "What exactly are you suggesting, Lord Magnus?" The nobleman's smile was sharp as winter frost. "I invoke the ancient right of challenge, Lady Rosalind. Not combat, of course. That would be beneath the dignity of potential royalty. Instead, I propose a test of leadership. Prove that you possess the wisdom and strength necessary to guide this realm in times of crisis." Before anyone could object, Finn burst into the hall with urgent news that made Magnus's challenge seem prophetically timed. "Your Majesty, we've received word from Millhaven. The eastern village has been attacked by rogues. Heavy casualties reported, survivors trapped in the ruins." Rose felt ice form in her veins. Millhaven, she knew that name from her childhood, remembered her parents mentioning it as a trading partner to their own village. The parallels were too obvious to ignore, too perfectly designed to test her deepest fears. "I'll lead a rescue party immediately," Alaric declared, but Rose placed a gentle hand on his arm. "No," she said quietly, her voice carrying new authority. "This is my test to face. Lord Magnus wants to see if I can lead in crisis, then let me prove it." The journey to Millhaven took them through forests that grew increasingly familiar as they traveled east. Rose rode at the head of a small group of volunteers, her enhanced senses alert for any sign of the rogues that had wreaked such devastation. But as they crested the final hill and the village came into view, her breath caught in her throat. The destruction was eerily similar to what she remembered from her own childhood. Buildings burned, debris scattered, the acrid scent of violence hanging heavy in the air. For a moment, Rose felt 14 years melt away, and she was 8 years old again, hiding beneath floorboards while monsters destroyed everything she loved. But then she heard it, a child's cry from somewhere in the ruins. All thoughts of her own trauma vanished as Rose spurred her horse forward, leaping from the saddle before the animal had fully stopped. Her wolf senses guided her through the wreckage to where a young girl, perhaps 6 years old, crouched in the remains of what had once been a home. "It's all right," Rose murmured, approaching slowly with her hands visible. "I'm here to help." The child looked up with eyes wide with terror and hope in equal measure. "Mama and Papa won't wake up," she whispered. "The monsters came and they won't wake up." Rose's heart clenched, but this time the pain was different. Not the helpless anguish of her own childhood, but the fierce protectiveness of someone with the power to make a difference. She gathered the little girl into her arms, feeling Luna power flow through her hands to ease the child's physical hurts and calm her emotional trauma. "My name is Rose," she said gently, "and I promise you, The monsters won't hurt you again." Over the next hours, Rose worked with quiet efficiency to organize the rescue efforts. She used her Luna abilities to locate survivors trapped beneath debris, to heal the wounded with golden light that flowed from her palms, and to comfort the traumatized with a presence that radiated safety and hope. But most importantly, she made decisions. Swift, clear choices about resource allocation, evacuation priorities, and temporary shelter arrangements. Each choice felt natural, instinctive, as if she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. When the immediate crisis had passed and the survivors were safely settled in a makeshift camp, Rose found herself standing at the edge of the ruins with Alaric beside her. "You were remarkable," he said quietly. "I've never seen leadership so natural, so intuitive. You turned a disaster into a rescue, trauma into healing." Rose looked back at the camp, where children who had lost everything were now laughing around carefully tended fires, where adults who had faced death were already making plans to rebuild. "I understand their pain," she said simply. "But more than that, I understand that pain doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning of something stronger." The realization hit her with stunning force. Her own trauma, the nightmares that had haunted her for years, the fear that had kept her wolf locked away, all of it had prepared her for this moment. She hadn't just survived her childhood horror. She had been transformed by it into someone who could help others survive theirs. When they returned to Nordvale Castle the next day, Lord Magnus was waiting with obvious expectation of her failure. But the reports that had preceded them told a different story, of a leader who had turned catastrophe into hope, who had saved lives through both power and wisdom. "It seems," Magnus said stiffly, "that Lady Rosalind has passed her test admirably. I withdraw any objections to her suitability as Luna Queen." That evening, alone in the royal gardens where this had all begun, Rose walked among the roses with Alaric's hand warm in hers. The trauma that had defined so much of her life felt different now, not a wound that weakened her, but a source of strength that would help her protect others. "No more hiding," she said, looking up at him with eyes that held no trace of the frightened girl she had once been. "No more running from what I am." Alaric's smile was brilliant with love and pride. "Then let's make it official. Rose Fletcher, Luna Queen of Nordvale, will you marry me?" The proposal should have terrified her with its implications and responsibilities. Instead, Rose felt nothing but joy as she rose on her toes to kiss the man who had saved her in so many ways. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Always yes." Above them, the moon shone down with silver approval, blessing the union of Alpha and Luna that would reshape the kingdom and heal hearts that had been broken for far too long. Rose Fletcher had found her destiny at last, not despite her trauma, but because of how she had chosen to transform it into strength. The frightened child who had hidden beneath blood-stained floors was gone forever, replaced by a woman who would ensure no other child would have to face such horrors alone. Chapter 7. Healing the Broken. The dawn that followed Rose's successful demonstration of her powers brought with it a messenger bearing news that would test everything she had learned about leadership and her own strength. A distant cousin of the royal line, Lord Edmund Blackwater, had arrived at court with what he claimed was urgent business regarding the kingdom's stability. Rose found herself summoned to the throne room, where Lord Blackwater stood before the assembled council, with the bearing of a man who believed himself to be delivering divine judgment. His pale blue eyes swept over her with undisguised disdain, taking in her simple dress and the way she carried herself with quiet confidence, rather than aristocratic arrogance. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being heard, "word has reached the outer territories regarding your unconventional choice for Luna Queen. There are many who question whether someone so recently emerged from the servant class can truly possess the wisdom and strength necessary to guide our realm through the challenges that lie ahead." Rose felt the familiar warmth of her Luna power stirring in response to the veiled insult. But she kept her expression serene. She had learned much in recent weeks about the political currents that flowed beneath the surface of court life, and she recognized this challenge for what it truly was. Not concern for the kingdom's welfare, but wounded pride at seeing the established order disrupted. "What do you propose, Lord Blackwater?" King Alaric asked. his tone carefully neutral, though Rose could sense the tension radiating from his powerful frame. Unlike Magnus, who had always craved the throne for himself, Blackwater's words carried the weight of tradition rather than greed. His disdain did not come from hunger for power, but from the unshakable belief that bloodlines and titles defined worth. A test of leadership, Blackwater replied with obvious satisfaction. Not combat. That would be beneath the dignity of potential royalty. Instead, let Lady Rose prove that she possesses the qualities necessary to guide subjects in times of genuine crisis. Let her demonstrate that her recent awakening has prepared her for the responsibilities of queenship. Before anyone could object to what was clearly a trap designed to expose Rose's perceived inadequacies, Finn burst through the great doors of the throne room with urgent news that made the timing of Blackwater's challenge seem almost prophetic. "Your Majesty," he called out, his weathered face grim with concern. "We've just received word from Thorndale. The village has been attacked by a large pack of rogues. There are casualties, survivors trapped in the ruins, and the local militia has been overwhelmed." Rose felt ice form in her veins at the news. The description was horrifyingly familiar, awakening memories she had spent years trying to bury. But this time, she had the power to change the outcome. "I'll lead a rescue party immediately," Alaric declared, rising from his throne with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to action. "No," Rose said quietly, her voice carrying a new authority that surprised even her. "This is exactly the kind of test Lord Blackwater believes I should face. Let me prove that I can lead in crisis." Millhaven had tested her heart. Thorndale, she quickly realized, would test her mind. This was no longer about saving a handful of survivors. Here, dozens of families looked to her not only for rescue, but for guidance, and guidance meant choices that could divide or unite the realm itself. The journey to Thorndale took them through countryside that grew increasingly familiar as they traveled deeper into the Eastern Territories. Rose rode at the head of a carefully chosen group of volunteers, healers, guards, and supply carriers who had answered her call without hesitation. The trust they placed in her untested leadership was both humbling and empowering. As they crested the final hill and Thorndale came into view, Rose's breath caught in her throat. The destruction was eerily similar to what she remembered from her own childhood. Buildings reduced to smoking ruins, debris scattered across what had once been peaceful streets, the acrid scent of violence and fear hanging heavy in the air. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Rose felt 14 years melt away. She was 8 years old again, hiding beneath floorboards while monsters destroyed everything she loved. The phantom sounds of her parents' final screams echoed in her ears, and she fought the instinctive urge to retreat, to find somewhere dark and safe to hide until the danger passed. But then she heard it, a child's cry from somewhere deep in the ruins. All thoughts of her own trauma vanished as Rose spurred her horse forward, her enhanced senses guiding her through the wreckage with unerring precision. She found the source of the sound in what had once been a small cottage. A little girl, perhaps 7 years old, crouched in the remains of what had been her home. The child looked up at Rose with eyes wide with terror and desperate hope, her small face streaked with tears and ash. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the settling debris. "Mama and Papa won't wake up. The monsters came and they won't wake up." Rose's heart clenched with familiar pain. But this time the anguish was different. Instead of the helpless despair of her own childhood, she felt the fierce protectiveness of someone with the power to make a real difference. She knelt beside the child, letting her Luna abilities flow through her hands to ease the girl's physical injuries and calm her emotional trauma. "My name is Rose," she said gently, gathering the little one into her arms. "And I promise you, the monsters won't hurt you anymore. You're safe now." Over the following hours, Rose worked with quiet efficiency that surprised even her most devoted supporters. She used her enhanced senses to locate survivors trapped beneath collapsed buildings, directing rescue efforts with an intuition that seemed to anticipate problems before they arose. Her Luna power flowed freely, healing the wounded with golden light that brought hope to even the most desperate situations. But more than her supernatural abilities, it was Rose's natural leadership that transformed chaos into organized relief efforts. She made swift, clear decisions about resource allocation and evacuation priorities, always keeping in mind both immediate needs and long-term consequences. Each choice felt instinctive, as if she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. When a group of survivors began arguing over the distribution of limited supplies, Rose stepped forward with calm authority. "Everyone will be cared for," she said, her voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who would not be contradicted. "But those with the greatest need come first. The injured, the elderly, the children. We are all part of the same community now, and we will act accordingly." The arguing ceased immediately, replaced by the kind of cooperation that comes when people recognize true leadership. Rose watched families who had lost everything begin to care for neighbors who had also suffered, creating bonds that would outlast the current crisis. As the sun began to set and the immediate emergency had passed, Rose stood at the edge of the temporary camp they had established, watching children who had lost their homes laugh around carefully tended fires, while adults who had faced death made plans to rebuild. "You were remarkable," Alaric said quietly, appearing at her side with the silent grace that had always characterized his movements. "I've never seen leadership so natural, so instinctive. You turned a disaster into a foundation for something stronger." Rose looked back at the bustling camp, where tragedy was already being transformed into hope. "I understand their pain," she said simply. "But more than that, I understand that pain doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning of something better." The realization hit her with stunning force. Her own trauma, the nightmares that had haunted her for years, the fear that had kept her wolf locked away for so long. All of it had been preparing her for this moment. She hadn't just survived her childhood horror. She had been transformed by it into someone who could help others not merely survive, but thrive. When they returned to Nordvale Castle the following day, Lord Blackwater was waiting with obvious expectation of her failure written across his aristocratic features. But the reports that had preceded their return told a different story entirely, of a leader who had turned catastrophe into hope, who had saved lives through both supernatural power and very human wisdom. "It seems," Blackwater said stiffly, his tone making it clear that he found the outcome deeply disappointing, "that Lady Rose has passed her test admirably. I withdraw any objections to her suitability as Luna Queen." That evening, alone in the royal gardens where their relationship had first begun to change, Rose walked among her namesake flowers with Alaric's hand warm and steady in hers. The trauma that had defined so much of her early life felt different now. Not a wound that weakened her, but a source of strength that would help her protect others from similar suffering. "No more hiding," she said, looking up at him with eyes that held no trace of the frightened girl she had once been. "No more running from what I am or what I'm meant to become." Alaric's smile was brilliant with love and pride. "Then let's make it official, once and for all." He stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his brown eyes serious with intention. "Rose Fletcher, Luna Queen of Nordvale, will you marry me?" The formal proposal should have overwhelmed her with its implications and enormous responsibilities. Instead, Rose felt nothing but pure joy as she rose on her toes to kiss the man who had saved her in so many ways. "Yes," she whispered against his lips, tasting the promise of a future she had never dared to dream possible. "Always and forever, yes." Above them, the moon shone down with silver approval, blessing the union of Alpha and Luna that would reshape the kingdom and heal hearts that had been broken for far too long. Rose Fletcher had found her true destiny at last, not despite the trauma that had shaped her, but because of how she had chosen to transform that pain into the strength to heal others. Chapter 8. Crown of Moonlight. 3 months had passed since the trials that had transformed Rose Fletcher from a servant into the acknowledged Luna Queen of Nordvale, and the kingdom hummed with a prosperity that seemed to radiate outward from the very walls of the castle. The autumn air was crisp with promise, as representatives from every corner of the realm gathered for what would be remembered as the most significant coronation in living memory. Rose stood before the great mirror in her chambers, hardly recognizing the woman who gazed back at her. The simple brown dress of her servant days had been replaced by a gown of midnight blue silk that seemed to capture and reflect starlight in its depths. Her chestnut hair, once pulled back in a practical braid, now fell in loose waves around her shoulders, held in place by a circlet of silver that would soon be replaced by something far more significant. "You look magnificent," Princess Evangeline said softly from the doorway, her voice carrying none of the venom that had once characterized every interaction between them. Rose turned to face her former rival, noting with satisfaction the healthy color that had returned to Evangeline's cheeks. The months of healing had not been easy. Evangeline had endured rituals to purge the shadow magic, long nights where her screams echoed through the healer's halls, and endless hours of reflection forced upon her by Master Harold. What stood before Rose now was not sudden redemption, but a woman tempered by suffering and remorse. The shadow magic that had corrupted her for so long had been purged through months of careful healing, revealing the intelligent, compassionate woman who had been trapped beneath layers of familial manipulation and dark influence. "Thank you," Rose replied genuinely. "And thank you for staying. I know it couldn't have been easy, facing the court after everything that happened." Evangeline's smile was rueful, but genuine. "You could have had me executed for what I did, what my family's legacy drove me to do. Instead, you offered healing and redemption. How could I do anything but stay and help rebuild what we nearly destroyed?" The transformation in Evangeline was perhaps the most visible symbol of the changes that had swept through Nordvale under Rose's gentle but firm guidance. The princess had chosen to dedicate her knowledge of shadow magic to healing others who had been corrupted by similar dark influences, working alongside the kingdom's healers to develop new treatments for magical ailments. A knock at the chamber door interrupted their conversation, and Martha, the senior housekeeper who had watched Rose grow from a traumatized child into a queen, entered with tears of pride glistening in her eyes. "Your Majesty," she said, the title still sounding strange but wonderful on her lips. "It's time." The great cathedral of Nordvale had been transformed for the occasion, its soaring arches decorated with cascades of white roses and silver ribbons that caught the light streaming through stained glass windows. Every seat was filled with nobles, merchants, farmers, and craftspeople, a deliberate choice by Rose to ensure that her coronation included representatives from every level of society. Rose walked down the aisle with measured steps, her hand resting lightly on King Alaric's arm as he escorted her toward the altar where Master Harold waited with the ancient crown of the Luna Queens. The weight of hundreds of watching eyes should have been overwhelming, but instead, Rose felt only a deep sense of rightness, as if she were finally stepping fully into the role she had been born to fill. When they reached the altar, Alaric turned to face her, his brown eyes warm with love and pride. "Are you ready for this?" he murmured, his voice for her ears alone. "I've been ready my whole life," Rose replied, surprised by the truth of the statement. "I just didn't know it until now." Master Harold stepped forward, his aged hands steady as he lifted the crown, an ancient circlet of silver and moonstone that had not been worn in over 3 centuries. "Lady Rosalind Fletcher," he intoned in a voice that carried clearly throughout the cathedral, "do you swear to protect the innocent, to heal the wounded, and to guide this realm with wisdom and compassion?" "I do," Rose replied, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. "Do you swear to use your gifts not for personal gain, but in service to all who call this kingdom home?" "I do." "Then by the power vested in me by crown and custom, and with the blessing of the moon goddess herself, I crown you Luna Queen of Nordvale, protector of the realm, and mate to our Alpha King." The moment the crown touched her head, Rose felt a surge of power unlike anything she had experienced before. Not the wild, uncontrolled energy of her early awakening, but something deeper and more profound, the accumulated strength of every Luna Queen who had come before her, channeled through the ancient silver and moonstone. Golden light erupted from her skin, bathing the entire cathedral in warm radiance that spoke of healing and hope. Every person present felt it, a touch of her Luna power that eased old aches, mended minor ailments, and filled hearts with renewed optimism for the future. The crowd erupted into cheers that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cathedral, but Rose barely heard them. All her attention was focused on Alaric as he stepped forward to claim the kiss that would seal their union before the realm. "My queen," he murmured against her lips, the words carrying the weight of absolute devotion. "My king," she replied, tasting the promise of a future they would build together. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with music and dancing that spilled from the castle into the streets of the capital city. Rose moved through the festivities with grace and warmth, speaking with farmers about crop yields, discussing trade concerns with merchants, and taking time to kneel beside children who had traveled great distances just for the chance to see their new queen. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when she found herself face to face with several of the former princess contestants who had remained in the kingdom after finding their own matches among the noble houses. "Your Majesty," one of them said with a curtsy that held genuine respect rather than mere protocol, "we wanted to thank you for showing us that there are many different ways to find happiness. Some of us came here thinking we wanted a crown, only to discover we wanted something entirely different." Rose smiled, thinking of the announcements that had filled recent weeks. Engagements between former rivals who had discovered they were perfectly matched. Alliances formed between noble houses that would strengthen the entire realm, and new friendships that crossed old political boundaries. "The heart knows what it needs," Rose replied gently. "Sometimes we just have to be brave enough to listen." As the evening wore on and the formal festivities began to wind down, Rose stepped out onto a balcony that overlooked the moonlit gardens. The roses below were in their final bloom of the season, their perfume rising on the cool night air to mingle with the scent of approaching winter. Alaric joined her moments later, slipping his arms around her waist from behind as they stood together in comfortable silence. The sounds of celebration continued to drift up from the courtyard below, but here in their private moment, there was only peace. "I have news," Rose said softly, leaning back against his solid warmth. "Something I've been waiting for the right moment to share." She felt Alaric's attention sharpen with interest. "What kind of news?" Rose turned in his arms, her face glowing with joy that had nothing to do with her Luna powers. "The kind that means our kingdom will have an heir sooner than we expected." The words took a moment to register, but when they did, Alaric's face blazed with such happiness that Rose felt her own joy multiply tenfold. He lifted her off her feet and spun her around, both of them laughing with pure delight at the promise of the future growing within her. "How long have you known?" he asked, when he finally set her down, his hands moving protectively to rest against her still flat stomach. "Only a few days," Rose admitted. "I wanted to be certain before I told you. Our child will be the firstborn to a true Luna Queen in centuries. The implications alone will be handled when they need to be handled," Alaric said firmly. "Right now, I just want to celebrate the fact that we're going to be parents." Their moment of private joy was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger, his face grim, despite the celebration continuing around them. "Your Majesties," he said with urgent respect. "I bring word from the eastern borders. Scouts report unusual activity, large gatherings of nobles from the neighboring kingdoms. It appears that news of your unconventional rise to power has reached interested ears." Rose felt Alaric tense beside her, his protective instincts immediately engaged, but she found herself oddly calm as she processed the information. "Let them come," she said with quiet confidence. "If they seek to test our resolve, they'll discover that this kingdom is stronger than it has ever been. We have something they lack, the loyalty that comes from true leadership, not inherited privilege." The messenger bowed and departed to carry her response to the relevant military commanders, leaving Rose and Alaric alone once more beneath the watching moon. "Are you concerned?" Alaric asked, studying her face in the silver light. Rose considered the question seriously before answering. "No," she said finally. "Challenged, perhaps, but not concerned. Everything that has brought us to this moment, every trial, every trauma, every moment of doubt, has been preparing us for whatever comes next." She looked out over the kingdom spread below them, taking in the lights that twinkled in windows where families were safe and secure because of the choices they had made. Children who would grow up knowing that strength came not from cruelty but from compassion, that leadership was earned through service rather than demanded through birthright. Besides, Rose added with a smile that held all the confidence of a woman who had transformed her greatest weakness into her greatest strength, They're about to discover what happens when you threaten a Luna Queen who has finally learned to embrace her full power. Above them, the moon shone down with silver approval, blessing not just their union but the dynasty they would build together. From a child traumatized and hidden beneath blood-stained floors had risen a woman who would ensure no other child would face such horrors alone. The frightened servant who had once scrubbed these very stones was gone forever, replaced by a queen whose love would reshape not just a kingdom, but the very definition of what it meant to rule with both strength and mercy. The future stretched before them, bright with promise and challenges in equal measure. But Rose Fletcher, Luna, Queen of Nordvale, faced it without fear. For she had learned that the greatest magic of all was the power to transform pain into purpose, trauma into triumph, and love into a legacy that would endure for generations to come.